Hello. You decided the results. Ichar IV, the Siege of Antok, the Third Battle for Armageddon, even the Storm of Chaos. These battles for planets and empires were run by Games Workshop, but they were fought by players. Worldwide community events that could influence the story in the setting and books of Warhammer and 40k. The idea behind the campaigns was simple. Create a storyline in the pages of White Dwarf that could act as a narrative backdrop for countless tabletop battles. Then get the public to record their results in one central place. The aggregated scores could determine who won and what happened in the story that followed. Over the course of several years and several campaigns, the team at Games Workshop would develop new approaches, introduce new technologies, and embrace new ambitions in telling epic stories within their games. And if you ask me, it would set the stage for one of the greatest storytelling community-led events in gaming history. I'm Jordan, this is Jordan Sorcery, and today we're exploring the origins of the Games Workshop global campaigns. This video isn't going to be covering every single Games Workshop event. We're not getting into the roadshows, we're not getting into the one-off events. We're talking about the earliest handful of global campaigns. They started with just a weekend of gaming, and they built year on year with the introduction of new ideas and new approaches until they reached a peak that I believe was pretty spectacular. I am currently working on a series of videos all about that campaign. The 6th edition Warhammer Fantasy event, The Storm of Chaos, which featured books and comics, magazine articles for years in advance, story threads that ran through multiple armies books, and just some of the coolest storytelling ideas I have ever seen. But for many people, that amazing campaign, its ambition, its scale, was also a bit Icarus-like in its attempts to take flight, and perhaps it flew too close to the blazing sun, and the aftermath was maybe what you might expect. But this video isn't about that tension between storytelling and setting, between business managers and lawmasters. This is about everything that led up to that 2004 summer. But before we start looking at how a fun idea sprawled into a heady mix of ambition, scale, resources, technology, and audacity, don't forget to give this video a like if you like it. With all of that said, where does this particular story begin? Well, how about the sweltering UK heatwave of 1995 and an industrial planet called Ichar IV? The history of Ichar IV was detailed in the 2nd edition Tyranid Codex, published shortly before the campaign would take place. This imperial world was responsible for production of high volumes of ore and mycoprotein that are necessary resources for the wider Imperium. However, in recent years, an unusual religion had taken hold of the populace, and in time, the government of the entire world. After refusing to honour their obligations for the imperial tithe, the planet was subjected to military intervention by the Adeptus Arbites, and when that resulted in open rebellion, the Imperial Guard and the Adeptus Astartes of the Ultramarines chapter stepped in to quell the fury. What they found was a secret brotherhood who no longer worshipped the Imperium's emperor, but instead the four-armed emperor. What they found were gene stealers. What followed was a war for the occupation of the planet, a war that was roundly won by the Emperor's loyal Ultramarines. But what they did not realise was that with its dying breath, the patriarch of the Genestealer cult had issued forth a clarion call into deep space, a call soon to be answered by the tendrils of a far greater threat, the Hive Fleet Kraken. So that was the backdrop against which Games Workshop's first global campaign was going to take place. We've got extragalactic bugs, we've got space marines, we've got sharp sticks, and we've also got an idea. A few weeks ago, Jervis Johnson and Andy Chambers came up with an idea that was so insane that we just had to give it a go. They decided they wanted to run the biggest wargame campaign in the world, centered on the Tyranid invasion of the industrial planet Ichar IV. The plan is actually cunningly simple. Over the weekend of the 30th of September, Games Workshop stores throughout the world will run games of Warhammer 40,000 and Epic that pit the Tyranids on one side against the Space Marines, Imperial Guard, and Eldar, or any combination of these three, on the other. The results of all of these games will then be compiled to reveal the outcome of this massive planetary invasion. This first ever global campaign was designed to bring together the community, to get all sorts of players involved in all sorts of ways. It was not to be too restrictive. It was going to have a storyline, but also create the opportunity for people to play however they wanted. I don't think I've seen an example that was earlier or bigger than this, really. Obviously, there's all sorts of community gaming that's happened all over the place in many different ways, but in the wargaming space, it feels quite unique. I'm often put in mind of the meta plots of White Wolf RPGs and Vampire the Masquerade and the other monster games, but that wouldn't happen for another couple of years. And even L5R, Legend of the Five Rings, which had an enormous player-led meta plot which advanced through tournaments and gaming results, that was happening around about the same time in the CCG space. Games Workshop and the Ichar IV campaign really did feel like something brand new. And that cunning idea, it is really deceptively simple. Players were simply being asked to play games. The innovation here is that whether you played at home or in the store, whether you played with your friends or at a club, you could submit those results to one central place, to White Dwarf, and they would all be counted in this enormous collaborative storytelling exercise. It's really a fantastic idea, and one that just adds weight to the games you play and gives you more investment in the 40k universe. It would also be the cause of the biggest headache for Johnson in the campaign, and for the designers behind later events as well, because dealing with public inputs can sometimes be tricky. In the case of Ichar IV, Jervis had to spend the better part of a day sorting through the enormous number of submissions. Along with the results, there were battle reports, stories, original fluff, art, and illustrations. To make things easier when calculating the results, Jervis had assigned all of the Games Workshop stores to different hive cities on the Imperial planet. The Games Workshop headquarters were assigned to the Nemesis Hive, and their results were shared in White Dwarf 191. 16 players fielded 10,000 points aside and fought across 3 game tables to help determine if the Hive was saved from the Tyranid invasion. 2 of the battles, the Space Marine and Eldar defences, were fought to a bloody standstill, but the Imperial Guard mounted a valiant counterattack and scored a victory against the relentless Nids. Over in the mail order warehouse, an even larger battle was organised that apparently saw the entire Ultramarines 1st Company take to the field. That's 10 Terminator squads, 5 veteran Space Marine squads, 10 Land Raiders, plus more command staff, vehicles, and support weapons as well. It had been hard fought, but the Tyranids had failed to take any hives. And when the actual results from the public were counted, they'd look even less pretty for the Tyranid away team. Around 450 battle reports were submitted for the final count, with Jervis estimating that the points values involved added up to a total of more than 1.75 million. Rather than turn all of the submissions into a coherent story, Jervis opted to instead share snippets from many of them in a glorious 2-page spread in White Dwarf. Of the battles, 172 saw a Tyranid victory, but 274 recorded victories for the Imperium-Eldar alliance. None of the hive cities were lost to the invasion, and it was ultimately a strong showing for the bipeds. As this was all an event focused on the community aspect of playing games, I'm particularly fond of Jervis's final sign-off for the Ichar IV article. If you have a great idea for a game based on the Ichar IV campaign, don't just think about it, jot it down, get your mates round, and play it. Remember, the rules for Warhammer 40,000 and Epic are just starting points which allow you to take the game wherever you like. Have fun. 18 months later, and Jervis would bring us the second global campaign. This one would feature a few differences to Ichar IV though, building on the ambition and moving from the summer to the start of the year. It would also not just be one weekend, instead it would be multiple months. And it wouldn't be 40k, it would be Warhammer Fantasy. Unlike the near-infinite scale of 40k, where the potential to create a battleground out of thin air that could accommodate armies from every faction was almost limitless, the Warhammer world has always been a little bit more restrictive. In order to make use of the new Lizardman army that had recently been reintroduced for the 5th edition of Fantasy Battle, this campaign was to be built around Lustria's cold-blooded faction, and so a good excuse was needed for them to be abroad across the wider Warhammer world. At first, Jervis considered replicating exactly the Ichar IV format, and instead of having extragalactic Tyranids invading, he could have the Lizardmen invading the old world. But after some counsel from Rick Priestley and Andy Chambers, they decided that it probably wasn't great to put that much at stake, because it could change the old world irrevocably, with ziggurats in Altdorf and Saurus steam tanks and stuff like that. So they needed something that was a little bit simpler, but also a little bit more complex. Inspired by his love for that most 90s of classic sci-fi, The X-Files, Jervis settled onto something a lot more shadowy. Almost 1,000 years in Warhammer's past, the Bretonnian Duke de Lorraine led an army of knights deep into the Lustrian jungles on a quest to rob and plunder any treasures they could find. Amongst the spoils claimed by the decimated raiding parties were several golden plaques inscribed with glyphs. With their leaders killed by the Lizardmen Temple Guard, the remaining Bretonnians abandoned their honour and sailed to any ports across the globe that would have them, taking the plaques with them to the 4 corners of the world. Now, the time has come that the great Slan mage priest Mazdamundi has issued a proclamation to the Lizardmen. They must recover the plaques as part of a secret design. Using magical ley lines, the Lizardmen have been infiltrating the old world, teleporting raiding parties into the cover of darkness and magic, ensuring that their presence has gone unnoticed. In other places, the Lizards have employed agents from other factions and mercenaries to continue seeking out the artifacts that were lost, meaning that almost any army could be fielded in this campaign on either side of the conflict. These clandestine events formed the initial part of the campaign, fought in January 1997, with the secretive conspiracy behind the actions of Mazdamundi known only to Jervis. In February's White Dwarf 206, the plot progressed as Jervis revealed that another artifact stolen from the Lizardman Temple had now been located in a Bretonnian Crusader fort in Araby. The Staff of Jade would be the MacGuffin that would lead to larger scale battles and more obvious moves from the Lizardmen. It was also a good excuse for the creation of a huge diorama. The fort in which the Staff of Jade had been hidden was called Antok, and presumably in an allusion to the real-world historical event, the Siege of Antioch, it would be represented by an enormous siege. As a side note, the Wikipedia entry for the real-world event actually includes this piece of art by Sebastian Mamaro with the caption, "A detail of medieval miniature," which just appealed to me for some reason. When the ultimate goal of the Lizardmen was finally revealed by Jervis, everything became clear. Mazdamundi needed the plaques and the Staff of Jade to enact a spell whilst the planets were temporarily aligned. This would help prevent the Realm of Chaos from expanding threefold into the world. Interestingly, the results for the event were not shared month by month in real time. Instead, Jervis continued to reveal the secret conspiracy plot and encouraged players to submit new results during each phase of the campaign. Because the Lizardmen's actions were taking place in secret and they were utilising agents who did not know their true employers, there was the potential for results to come from pretty much any faction for either the good guys or the bad guys. For example, the Dark Elves scored the most victories on behalf of the Lizardmen, whilst the High Elves were the most frequent obstacles to Mazdamundi's plan. Unbeknownst to the forces of chaos, against whom the entire Lizardman operation was actually targeted, they had ended up aiding Mazdamundi more often than they fought against him. Skaven were the only faction who were forbidden from acting as agents of the Lizardmen, which actually turned out to be a lucky break for old Maz, as the Rats had the worst scoreline in the entire campaign. It's probably unsurprising given that they were opponents in the new core box, and they were the thieves that put the whole world at risk in the first place, but the Bretonnians were the most vehement rivals to the Lizardmen in the campaign. Fortunately for the Warhammer world, they lost significantly more battles than they won. Much as with the Ichar IV campaign, a double-page spread was given over to showing off submissions and stories that had been sent in for the Siege of Antioch, before the final results were shared. The calculation would be that the win rate for the Lizardmen and their agents in January and February would have to add together and total more than 100 if Mazda Mundi was to succeed and prevent the Realm of Chaos from expanding. With 1,283 battles fought, more than twice as many in the Ichar IV campaign, the Lizardmen win rate total came to 102, scoring a very close victory for the Lizards. So there you have it. The Lizardmen just managed to stop the Realm of Chaos from destroying the world. Of course, it's a shame that they had to flatten the city of Antok in order to do so, but you can't make an omelette without breaking some eggs, as they say in Britonia. For whatever reason, the Dark Conspiracy campaign didn't feature a studio battle report, but unlike Ichar IV, it had managed to involve every single faction in the game relatively organically, and the ability to choose sides also gave you quite a lot of flexibility. That would be something that would be beneficial for future events. There was also a pretty canny move from Jervis, because he hadn't actually explained what was at stake in the early portion of the event. There would always be an ongoing question when it came to the events about whether or not the results could be trusted, whether or not things had been fudged, whether or not the world was really in danger of changing based on the public actual results. But here, Jervis hadn't even said what was at stake, so he was able to see the earliest results before they published what was going to happen either way. I don't know if that influenced how anything was written, but it seems quite smart, and seems like something that probably could have been learned from for some of the later events where it got a bit more complicated. Games Workshop got extremely busy over the following years, with the release of games like Gorka Morka, Mordheim, Battlefleet Gothic, Warmaster, and lots of other products. So it wouldn't be until 2000 that there was another global campaign. The Imperial world of Armageddon is of vital importance to the Imperium, anchoring the Armageddon segmentum, supplying countless munitions to the Imperial Guard, and acting as a key node at the centre of navigational channels across space. Its importance has made it the envy of the forces of chaos, whose previous invasion blighted the land, but a more persistent threat has come in the form of the great Orc warlord, Ghazghkull Thraka. The second battle for Armageddon had seen Ghazghkull match wits, determination, and fury with the Imperial Commissar Yarrick. The Orc war was immense, and the fighting took a great toll on the planet, with Hades' Hive being a particularly intense flashpoint. Both Yarrick and Ghazghkull almost died in the battle, but somehow both survived. And yet, without Ghazghkull's leadership, the Orcs were overwhelmed and scattered, leaving the world in Imperial hands for the time being. Now, Ghazghkull, the Beast, has returned, and he wants to reclaim his lost prize in the third war for Armageddon. This campaign would be built around something new, something unique, unlike Ichar IV, which was designed to promote the new Tyranid army, or Dark Conspiracy, which was all about the Lizardmen and that returning army to the Warhammer world. This one wasn't about a single army at all. It was about a brand new codex, Codex Armageddon. Written by Andy Chambers, Jervis Johnson, and Gav Thorpe, this book would detail not just army lists, but the background to this world and this campaign. You know what? You'll probably get a better explanation of the book and the campaign from then White Dwarf editor, the much-loved and fondly nicknamed Fat Bloke, Paul Sawyer. This book is a significant departure from past styles of Codex in that it doesn't focus on one army or race, but on a campaign. In this case, the Third War for Armageddon. This doesn't mean it lacks an army list. Far from it. Codex Armageddon introduces four brand new army lists. A mechanized Imperial Guard regiment, the Armageddon Steel Legion, Orc Speed Freaks, and 2 Space Marine chapters, the Salamanders and the Black Templars. And Sawyer went on to introduce the global campaign as well. Everyone at Games Workshop got so excited about Codex Armageddon that we decided to run a worldwide campaign. We're asking you all to fight lots of games of 40k, Epic 40k, or Battlefleet Gothic, and send us the results. Playing games all summer? What a hardship, eh? Some of you may well remember Ichar IV, the global gaming event we ran a few years back. Well, the third War for Armageddon will run in a similar vein, but with a few enhancements. The first of these will be the Armageddon website, at which you'll be able to access all the background for the campaign, as well as registering the results of your games and checking out the game results as they flood in. As with the Ichar campaign, places in the real world were assigned to places on the Imperial world. That was to make it easier to work out which had fallen to the Orc War and their Chaos Space Marine and Dark Eldar allies, and which had been held by the Imperium. Apparently the Eldar were seen fighting on both sides of the conflict, and the Tyranids got involved as well, though they were, like a big boy at a buffet, selfishly just in it for the biomass. A battle results form was included in White Dwarf for folks to cut out, fill in, and send through, and there was an epic 11-player battle report in the launch issue as well. Over the following months, a huge number of pages in White Dwarf would be utilised to expand upon the story of the invasion, show off new armies and paint schemes, and provide campaign updates as things progressed. The Armageddon website proved to be an epic enhancement, and apparently over 33,000 games were logged during the August campaign. As with previous campaigns, the White Dwarf offices were still inundated with hundreds of battle reports, photos, and artworks from players. The final tally of results saw the Imperium accumulate 54% of the victories, meaning that the planet remained in their control, but with big orc wins in some regions like the plains of Anthrad and the Hive Tempestora. It wouldn't be considered a total victory for the Imperials. Instead, Armageddon would remain a world at war, infested with greenskins and constantly at threat. All in all, the third War for Armageddon was marked as a great success. The campaign had brought in a huge number of players, lots of games were reported, and the website had been a huge success as well. In fact, you can actually still see the archived website via the Wayback Machine, and it is a wonderful way to while away an afternoon with a cup of tea. So I've included a link in the description below. The creation of that site, the sheer scale of community involvement, the dedicated codex, the many pages of articles and lore and conversion guides that were included in White Dwarf, all of that seemed to elevate the entire campaign and prove that people wanted to be part of these enormous scale events, submitting their results and helping to drive the story, the tangible plot hooks that had been laid out at the start of the campaign. Now it would be time to sample that same approach in the Warhammer Fantasy world. In 2001, the 6th edition of Warhammer would draw the Dark Eyes of Chaos once again, as a powerful and mysterious being summoned forth the Dark Shadows campaign. White Dwarf 260 would come with a free 24-page campaign guide, similar to and only slightly slimmer than the Armageddon Codex, and more focused on scenarios than army lists. Written by Alessio Cavatore, Jake Thornton, and Space McQuirk, and based on a concept from Gav Thorpe and Rick Priestley, the booklet provided information about playing in a Warhammer campaign. It introduced the setting for this new event, the fog-shrouded island of Albion. I just want to take a moment here to dwell on the incredible cover art for the supplement that was done by Dave Gallagher, and of course the map of Albion itself by Nuala Kennedy, which is truly amazing. And it also features some of the all-time best Warhammer puns. Isle of Wights, annotated with many barrows here, or Here Be Wales. There were rules for the weather and magic of this island of storms, and listings for new character models that would be available for any player to use in the game. The Dark Emissaries spread disorder on behalf of their shadowy master, whilst the Truthsayers stood against them on the side of light. And the very marshes of Albion themselves took humanoid form as the fen beasts rose up from the bogs to do battle. All three received brand new miniatures sculpted by Chris Fitzpatrick, Trish Carden, and Colin Grayson to represent them in Warhammer Fantasy battles and in Warmaster. The story for Dark Shadows was centered around the mythical land of Albion. This had been part of Warhammer lore dating quite far back, but for whatever reason, it had been dropped out of the books and not really talked about quite so much for a number of years. But now, it had magically re-emerged from the fog and was ripe for plundering and looting and all kinds of magical shenanigans. With the fog parted and the White Cliffs sighted, rumours spread across the old world of fabulous riches that could be found on this mysterious island. For many moons, shamans native to Albion had travelled the old world, warning army commanders of the dangers of the island and the seas around it. These truthsayers would rather their homeland did not become a battleground for the avaricious armies of others. Meanwhile, in hushed tones, other strangers had been whispering in the ears of any warriors whose hearts were black enough to hear them. These dark emissaries spoke of a dark master who offered great gifts to those who would act on his behalf. Because, or despite the words of these travellers, huge numbers of raiding parties of every size and description left ports from across the old world and descended on the beaches of Albion. As with the previous campaign, results could be submitted by mail or on a special subsection of the Games Workshop website, and the campaign was set to run for 6 weeks. The 6 scenarios in the booklet were designed to support a narrative for that time period, with, for example, the first scenario simulating the arrival of an army on the shores of Albion, building up to a final scenario that was a rain-soaked pitched battle for the fate of Albion itself. There were participation games in stores, and players could of course submit their home or club games as before, but there was also a Dark Shadows roadshow that toured the UK, giving players the chance to lead or fight a Dark Elf force led by Malus Darkblade. And all of this was in service of a singular goal. What that goal was again not that clear. We'd gone back to the same kind of approach of the Dark Conspiracy. We knew something evil was afoot, but not specifically what it was, because the Dark Master wanted to unleash some kind of calamity on the Warhammer world, but we're not sure precisely what that is. But we were told that there would be rewards for the victors, not just avoiding the end of the world, but also the acquisition of some unique magic items. In the studio campaign, things were hard fought, and whilst there was no resounding victory, it seemed like the forces of darkness took a slight win, helped no doubt by self-professed Phil Dirty Rat Kelly managing to score 6 out of 6 victories with his Skaven Horde. Almost 56,000 battles were recorded in the final scores, with Dark Elves featuring in by far the most games, just over 9,000 of them. I don't know if they corrected for the UK roadshow that was all about the Dark Elves or not, but I guess that's by the by. As any army could declare for the forces of light or the forces of the Dark Master, it was interesting to see the likes of Chaos Warriors or Skaven fighting for good, and High Elves or Bretonnians fighting for evil. Ultimately, the Truthsayers and the forces of light secured 56% of the victories, averting that nebulous calamity that may have befallen the world. The magic items that were ransacked from the Isle of Wights and the Citadel of Lead were awarded to specific armies based on performance in the campaign, and were revealed to have been left behind by the old ones long ago. The Dark Elves unsurprisingly scored the most victories, taking home to Naggaroth 3 items, including a Gauntlet of Power shaped into a mighty fist and shimmering with magical energy. The High Elves got 3 items as well, including a Claw of Devastation, a magic weapon shaped like a taloned claw, which pulsed with dark power. The Empire secured something called a Hex Staff, and the Dwarfs looted a Blade of Shining Death, a sword that was enveloped in glittering light that could slice through the toughest armour. Albion itself would remain a feature on the Warhammer map for a while longer, and there would be more Dogs of War heralding from the Island of Storms. The Truthsayers, Dark Emissaries, and Fenbeasts would be added to the Dogs of War lists as well. In an ominous closing remark in the Dark Shadows final article, Gav Thorpe teased the future of the Warhammer world. The machinations of the Dark Master have been set back for now, but will come to fruition sooner or later, and details of this will appear in issues of White Dwarf and Warhammer books in the future. So it ain't all over yet, not by a long way. The identity of the Dark Master was never revealed during the actual Dark Shadows campaign, but it would form the basis of the plot for the upcoming Storm of Chaos in a couple of years. I think we can see from these 4 events so far just how different things had become, how they'd evolved and changed. Experimentation had taken place, new technologies had been introduced like the website, which had allowed just a huge increasing scale of submissions from the public, and the ability to be tactical and strategic in brand new ways. All of that was added to by dedicated books, by making campaign storylines that had a more expansive impact and actually seemed to play a role in the development of the settings. The introduction of specific miniatures designed just for that campaign, which would live on once it was finished. All of this stuff speaks to trying out different ways to build out a campaign that is just enormous in scope and scale and ambition, and that is exactly where things would go in the next couple of events. The use of these different innovations had been inconsistent across the ones we'd seen so far because that experimentation was testing out what could work. The next two would try and bring to bear everything that had been learned, use all of the technologies, all of the opportunities, all of the resources that they discovered over the course of the last 10 or so years. And that would also introduce more complexity and more challenges. You would have to deal with the whims and the unpredictability of the audience and the player base, and what happens when they start to organize themselves in order to do better across the entire campaign. It goes from individual games out in the sort of wider community, games in stores, games at clubs, games at home, to something that is far more community-led, but in a slightly different way. It is an interesting evolution, perhaps an expected one when you introduce the internet into these kinds of things, but it's kind of remarkable how things changed over the course of the next couple of years. For 40k, it would be the Eye of Terror campaign that would see Abaddon and his Chaos forces spill out into the Imperium in an attempt to take Cadia and to battle across pretty much the entire of Imperial space. There would be major character deaths, there would be shocking revelations and destruction, and really some very interesting results. And whilst I would love to spend time delving into Abaddon's first 13th Black Crusade in this video, there just isn't time. It deserves so much more. But I will have to leave that for the future, because right now I'm working on my videos about the Storm of Chaos. In a number of weeks, I will be sharing my videos about the Storm, about how it definitely tied into existing lore and tried to build on and evolve it into something new, about how it introduced enormous stakes for the old world and tried to progress the story to a brand new place that allowed different types of gameplay and set the stage for a future Warhammer world that was all about fantasy battles. This was a campaign that introduced comic books and novels, that seeded story elements and characters a year in advance, if not more. It was an undertaking that I think was truly incredible, and whilst it was flawed in many ways, and a lot of its final aftermath was muddy, to put it lightly, it was genuinely, I think, an ambitious and incredible attempt to try something brand new with the Warhammer world that could have really wow, I'm losing my words because I'm that excited about it. I think it could have built the foundations for where the Warhammer world went in new editions that potentially might not have led it down the path it went to. Now, it's easy for me to say that in retrospect, but what I'll be looking at in that video is the history of the development, why it was attempted, how it was attempted, and how all of these different components were brought together in service of a single story, and a really interesting one, I think. I will also be sharing a video, or a couple of videos, that tell that story from within the Warhammer world. They are pure lore. I'm really excited about just spending a bit of time telling fun stories, because I think that this is an epic story. This is, in a way, Games Workshop's Warhammer Fantasy, Lord of the Rings, or it's Game of Thrones. It's that kind of story where everything is at stake, and we are led to a precipice for the old world. Really super fun stuff, I think. So that's coming soon. You can look forward to that on the channel. If those videos do well, then potentially I will be able to come back and take a look at doing the Eye of Terror in a similar way. A lore video and a development history, because, you know, the impacts and the aftermath of the Eye of Terror event are equally interesting for the 40k universe, I think. And, of course, there were other events that came after the Storm of Chaos and the Eye of Terror, Medusa 5, the Nemesis Crown, the War of the Ring. They're just isn't time here to go into all of those. Perhaps one day I'll be able to get into some of that stuff too. If you would like to support the work I do here on the channel and potentially see some of those videos down the line, then you can take a look at my Patreon. You'll get access to my Discord, regular updates, exclusive and early access content, as well as a monthly giveaway. And all of that is available via a link in the description below. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video if you enjoyed it. I've also got a second channel, Jordan Sorcery Pods, where you can see all of my long-form conversations and interviews. So please go and check that out as well if you're interested. For now, thank you very much for watching. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery. The Dark Master was not Martha, and it was not my other cat Hank either. It was actually Be'lakor, and he was involved in Mordheim as well as the Shadow Lord. I think this story is really fun.